In Russia, there is increasing talk about attacking the Baltic countries and Finland. And today, beyond the rhetoric, there have been several actions by the Russian authorities that indicate the Kremlin is actually preparing for war against Europe. The State Duma of the Russian Federation has officially passed a law that allows Vladimir Putin to use the Russian armed forces in any country where Russians have been arrested or are being persecuted. And this is one of the reasons for armed aggression against Europe. At the same time, Vladimir Putin's courtier, Sergei Shoigu, announced the possibility of invoking Article 51 of the UN Charter for self-defense against Finland and the Baltic states, in connection with the alleged flights of Ukrainian drones through their territory to strike Russia. Although this is a complete fake, but as a casus belli, as they say, it will do. At the same time, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation published a list of European enterprises that it will consider legitimate military targets due to their production of components for Ukrainian drones. Moreover, experts are increasingly pointing out that Russia is ready to launch a hybrid war against the Baltic countries in order to speed up Ukraine's surrender through pressure from the Baltic side. In general, let's put all these arguments together and discuss them. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and leave any comment under this video. I would really appreciate it. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Peachy News. The link is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. So, Russia is actively rolling out different elements of an information operation to prepare for war against the Baltic countries. Well, let me start with the latest news. Sergei Shoigu, the former Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, recently stated that Russia might use Article 51 of the United Nations Charter for self-defense against Finland and the Baltic countries. This is supposedly due to Ukrainian drones flying over their territory to strike Russia. Let me quote Shoigu. Recently, there have been more cases when Ukrainian drones strike Russia through Finland and the Baltic countries. If these states deliberately provide their airspace according to international law, Article 51 of the UN Charter comes into effect, which concerns the inherent right of states to self-defense in the event of an armed attack. This is a very important statement, because it is essentially a fake casus belli for attacking the Baltic countries. The story about alleged Ukrainian drones flying through the Baltic countries into Russia to carry out attacks, remember on Ust-Luga and Primorsk, that's fake. Russia itself made up this story about the flight and is spreading it as a casus belli for escalation against Europe. Let me go into more detail here again. We've already discussed this topic before in one of the previous episodes, but let's go over it once more. Shoigu claims that the Baltic countries are providing their airspace so that Ukraine can fly around from the other side. They launched their drones, they flew over the Baltic countries, and from that side, from the Baltic side, they attacked the Leningrad region of the Russian Federation. And at the end of March, let me remind you, Ukrainian drones massively attacked Russian ports in the Leningrad region, in particular Ust-Luga and Primorsk. That's when the Russians came up with this story that Ukrainian drones supposedly fly through the Baltic countries to attack Russia. And to show just how stupid and primitive this fake is, I'm using only official Russian sources. I'm not going to get into any kind of elaborate investigation, I'll just present the information. The Russians themselves openly spread it. The drone bomber channel visualized how, on the days when the Ust-Luga and Primorsk ports were attacked, air raid alerts unfolded across Russia on March 23, 24, and 26. In these videos that you are about to see, it's clearly visible in what sequence and order the air raid alerts went off in Russia, and where the air defense systems were activated exactly on those nights when the ports in the Leningrad region were attacked. So, if Ukrainian drones were not flying through Russian territory, but were entering Russia through the Baltic countries, then the question arises, why were alarms in Russia going off starting from the Ukrainian border and systematically moving toward that very Leningrad region? What exactly were the Russian air defense systems shooting down over their own regions? If supposedly at that time the drones were actually flying somewhere over the Baltic countries, Why did the alarm go off specifically in those regions where, according to the Kremlin's version, the drones supposedly didn't fly over? And the most interesting thing is, why does this alarm point directly to the Leningrad region, where on those same dates there were actual strikes? But it's important to understand that the escalation from the Kremlin is consistent, and here we need to build a chain of events. The Kremlin is gradually escalating tensions around the Baltic countries. Today, Shoigu states that Russia may invoke Article 51 of the UN Charter on Self-Defense to attack the Baltic countries and Finland. Just yesterday, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation published a list of European enterprises that it will consider legitimate military targets due to their production of components for Ukrainian UAVs. I'll now quote the official statement from the Russian Federation's Ministry of Defense. According to available information, on March 26, 2026, the leadership of several European countries made a decision to increase the production and supply of drones to Ukraine for strikes on Russian territory. We regard this decision as a deliberate step leading to a sharp escalation of the military-political situation across the entire European continent and the gradual transformation of these countries into Ukraine's strategic rear. The implementation of the announced scenarios will lead to unpredictable consequences. So this is basically a threat, like since Europe has become Ukraine's rear, it means it's also a combat zone and the Russians are threatening to attack it as well. And so the Kremlin has moved on to the stage of threatening direct strikes on Europe. Only now these are no longer just vague threats. This is a specifically designated list. The list from the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation includes 21 enterprises from 12 countries, and these are the United Kingdom, Germany, Denmark, Latvia, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Poland, the Czech Republic, Spain, Italy, Israel, and Turkey. Even Turkey, just imagine how Recep Tayyip Erdogan will react to this. And it's important to note here that it's actually hard to understand what logic the Russians are following when making this list. Because, for example, many companies that publicly announce joint drone production with Ukraine are not on the list. In other words, this was not hidden at all. Obviously, this is a threat, but this is already a direct threat to Europe. These specific sites from the Russian Ministry of Defense's list are unlikely to be attacked directly. It's more likely they're targets for sabotage. And most importantly, the day before, the State Duma of the Russian Federation passed in the first reading a bill that allows, by decision of the bald, stinky dictator Vladimir Putin. Sorry, let me correct that. The President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, to use the Russian armed forces abroad to protect Russians who are being prosecuted. Well, in other words, if some Russian is being tried in another country, Putin will be able to send troops there to protect him. The amendments to the law propose to grant the President of the Russian Federation, quote, the right to use the armed forces extraterritorially to protect Russian citizens who are arrested, detained, or subjected to criminal or other prosecution by decisions of foreign courts or international judicial bodies in which Russia does not participate. And who would have thought the bill was prepared by the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation? And it is perfectly suited to justify sending troops to the Baltic countries to protect Russian-speaking people. On the other hand, experts are already suggesting that Vladimir Putin is really so afraid of an international tribunal that he is already trying to make preemptive threats. This could refer to tribunals whose creation is initiated by individual countries or international organizations for the criminal prosecution of Russia. First and foremost, Vladimir Putin for unleashing an unprovoked bloody war against Ukraine. Others believe that Russians want to legally formalize the protection of the Shadow Fleet's ships. At the same time, the Kremlin is talking more and more about war with Europe, and this definitely cannot be ignored. That's why we discuss such topics on this YouTube channel. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you found this episode interesting and useful, I would appreciate your support for the work of this channel. You can support financially with any donation or paid subscription using the links and details in the description of this video or by using the QR code on your screen. I would appreciate your support. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.